Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deepest part of the night. Make sure you're comfortable and fully settled in for a long one. If the sound of rain helps you shut down and drift into sleep, then you've found your sanctuary here, a place where darkness meets calm. And if this blend of deep horror and a calming storm helps you find that inner quiet, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe for more long, rainy nights. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Now, let the rain wash your worries away, breathe in the silence of the storm. Let's begin the journey. Story 1. Every long-haul driver knows the urge to take a shortcut. It's usually a bad idea. The roads are worse, you waste more gas, and you end up in the middle of nowhere. But last spring, driving from Flagstaff to Albuquerque, I thought I'd found the exception. I was running late, and my GPS glitched, showing an alternate route that shaved off a crucial 45 minutes, an old, decommissioned section of US Route 86 that allegedly skirted the edge of a mountain range. It was 1 a.m. when I found the on-ramp. I almost missed it. It was hidden behind a cluster of dead junipers, marked by a faded, rust-eaten sign reading, "Future Bypass 86. The ramp was narrow, barely wide enough for my pickup, and the pavement was cracked, covered in gravel and weeds. I figured it was just an old access road. I switched the truck into four-wheel drive and crawled up the incline. When I reached the top, the road changed completely. The gravel disappeared. The pavement was immaculate, fresh, black, smooth as glass, with freshly painted white lines. There were no weeds, no cracks, no debris. It looked like it had been finished yesterday, though I knew the state hadn't funded this project in 30 years. Even stranger, there were no guardrails and no shoulder. Just a smooth ribbon of road flanked immediately by pitch black, 40-foot high concrete retaining walls. It felt less like a road and more like a massive, concrete trench carved into the earth. I pulled onto the clean asphalt. The GPS immediately lost signal, but I didn't care. The road was straight and perfect. I put the pedal down and started moving, feeling the exhilarating speed of driving on a road built for high velocity. But the speed didn't match the distance. I passed a mile marker sign, mm 47. 5 minutes later, I passed another one, mm 46. 5 more minutes, and another, mm 45. The distance seemed to be consuming time unnaturally. It felt like I was driving in place, and the mile markers were simply sliding past me on a treadmill. The scenery never changed. It was always the same imposing concrete wall on either side, topped by an endless, dark sky. I tried to turn back. I slowed down, looking for any kind of turnaround, any break in the wall. There were none. The road was a flawless, one-way channel with no entrance, and no exit save for the ramp I had taken. I was trapped on a road to nowhere. Then I saw the lights. Far ahead, maybe a mile or two down the road, there were 2 red dots, a set of tail lights. Relief flooded me. I wasn't alone. I sped up, thinking if I could catch them, I could signal for help or find out where they were going. I drove at 85 miles per hour for the next 20 minutes, never once letting up on the gas. I gained no ground. The red lights remained exactly the same distance away, hovering in the darkness like twin, mocking eyes. I tried calling on my cell phone again. Dead silence. I flipped on the CB radio, scanning all 40 channels. Nothing but pure, cold static, the kind of static that feels heavy, like it's waiting to speak. The isolation became unbearable. I pulled the truck over and shut off the engine. The silence was absolute. Not a chirp, not a whisper of wind, not the hum of power lines. I killed the headlights. It was the darkest I have ever seen the world. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and looked up at the wall beside me. It was so tall it blocked out the horizon, but I noticed something on the wall that hadn't been there before. In the middle of the smooth, unblemished concrete, etched deep into the stone, was a set of tally marks. Hundreds of them. Faded, but clearly visible, scratched there with something sharp. And next to the marks, scrawled in what looked like dried mud or rust, was one single word: waiting. I started the engine and slammed it into gear. I had to get off this phantom road. I didn't care if I had to ram the wall. I sped up, determined to find a way out, when the road suddenly tilted upwards. I was driving onto an overpass. The overpass wasn't built over a river or another road. It was built over the valley floor, bridging two peaks. As the truck gained altitude, the concrete retaining walls dropped away, replaced by standard steel railing. I risked a glance over the side. The darkness below was absolute. I couldn't see the bottom of the ravine. No trees, no lights, just the void. And from that void, I began to hear sounds. Distant, muffled sounds of human activity. Laughter. Shouting. The clatter of plates. It sounded exactly like a picnic or a massive party happening hundreds of feet below me in the pitch blackness. I slammed on the brakes, stopping the truck right in the middle of the overpass. The laughter swelled, growing clearer, happier, more vibrant. Then, from the darkness just beyond the steel railing, a hand reached up. It was pale, elongated, and covered in fine black hair. It gripped the steel railing and started pulling itself up. I saw its head next. It was wearing a faded leather aviator cap, and its eyes were wide, white circles staring up at the road. It wasn't laughing. It wasn't shouting. Its mouth was stretched open in a silent, desperate scream. I didn't need to see the rest of the body. I threw the truck into reverse, flooring the gas pedal. I backed up the highway at 70 miles an hour, watching the rearview mirror. The creature was pulling itself over the railing, its full form appearing in my headlights, lanky, unnaturally jointed, and looking like a corpse that had spent decades at the bottom of a dry well. I drove backward until I saw the cracked, gravel on-ramp where I had entered. I spun the wheel hard, fishtailing the truck onto the shoulder, and bounced down the original, abandoned dirt road. I hit the main interstate highway with a jolt that almost blew a tire. I looked back at the mountain. The perfect, new, black road was gone. The concrete retaining walls were gone. Even the rust-eaten sign for Future Bypass 86 had vanished. There was only the rough, dirt hillside and the dense, dark scrub brush. I never told anyone the full story. I know I drove on a road that doesn't exist, a detour into a place built for those who drive too fast and go too far. The last time I saw those red lights was in my nightmares. But sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I pull over to stretch my legs, and if I stand perfectly still, I can hear a faint, distorted sound on the wind, not laughter, but that echoing, desperate scream coming from a deep, unseen ravine. And I know the phantom road is still out there, waiting for the next tired driver to take the wrong turn. Story 2. The terrifying thing about the elevator game isn't the ghosts, it's the rules. It's the rigid, almost mathematical process that somehow unlocks the door to a place that shouldn't exist. My friends and I, 3 of us, me, Ben, and Liam, were always chasing urban legends. We didn't believe in magic, but we believed in experience, and the elevator game was the ultimate challenge. The rules are simple, but unforgiving. You need a building that has at least 10 floors. You must be alone when you start. The sequence must be followed exactly: 4th floor, 2nd, 6th, 2nd, 10th, 5th, and then back to the 1st. But the most important rule is what happens on the 5th floor. If an old woman gets on the elevator, you must not look at her, and you must not speak to her. We chose the old Sterling Tower, an abandoned 50-story office building downtown. It was perfect, tall, quiet, and known for having bizarre maintenance elevators that were still functional, even if they were slow and rattling. We snuck in through the basement access just before midnight. We found the service elevator, pressed the button, and waited for the doors to close. The air inside the small metal box was stale and smelled faintly of burning oil. I started the sequence. 4th floor, the doors opened to an ordinary, dusty hallway. Ben quickly hit the button for the 2nd floor. 2nd floor, the elevator paused. The lights flickered violently, plunging us into darkness for a split second before sputtering back to life. We were all silent. 6th floor, we didn't stop here long. The doors hissed open and immediately closed. 2nd floor, Again this time, the elevator stopped, but the doors remained stubbornly shut for a full 30 seconds before continuing their agonizing climb. 10th floor. We reached the 10th floor. According to the rules, this is the first crucial marker. The lights in the elevator dimmed slightly, shifting from a sterile white to a yellowish, sickening amber. The building outside the door seemed quieter, heavier. We quickly hit the button for the 5th floor. 5th floor. The elevator descended, humming low and loud. When the doors slid open on the 5th floor, the hallway was completely dark. The emergency lights were dead. And there she was. Standing in the frame of the doorway was an old woman. She was impossibly tall, bent over with age, and dressed in clothes that looked like they were disintegrating, a faded, floral housecoat and slippers. Her skin was the color and texture of wet tissue paper. She did not look at us. She stepped onto the elevator, her weight causing the cab to dip and the cables to groan under the strain. She stood directly between us and the control panel. Terror, pure and chemical, flooded my veins. Every fiber of my being wanted to scream at Liam and Ben, but I remembered the rule. Do not look at her. Do not speak to her. We all stared fixedly at the rusted floor, our hands clasped tightly, trying to project absolute silence. The woman smelled like ozone and dried flowers. The silence she brought with her was suffocating. We were trapped in a metal box with something profoundly wrong. My fingers, acting on pure instinct, reached out and pressed the button for the 10th floor. The rules state that if another passenger gets on, you must go back up to the 10th floor to continue the ritual. The elevator started its slow, grinding ascent. As we passed the 6th, 7th, and 8th floors, I could feel the old woman's gaze boring into the top of my head. I wanted to turn and look, to confirm she was real, but I didn't dare. When we hit the 9th floor, the woman spoke. Her voice was raspy, dry, and sounded like two pieces of rock being ground together. Are you going up? The rule screamed in my head, do not answer. We said nothing. Ben started silently weeping, tears dripping onto the metal floor. The elevator reached the 10th floor again. The doors opened, and the scent of ozone intensified. The lights were now a deep, angry red. The woman stepped out. But before the doors could close, she turned back and gave us a smile. Her mouth was too wide, and her teeth were small, black pegs. She raised a long, skeletal finger and pointed directly at me. Then, she said, "He is waiting for you." The door slid shut. I didn't hesitate. I slammed my hand on the button for the 1st floor. This is the final step. If you reach the 10th floor and successfully escape the other passenger, you must hit the button for the 1st floor immediately. If the ritual is working, the elevator should bypass all other floors and take you straight down. It did. The elevator began its descent, bypassing 9, 8, 7. But when we reached the 5th floor, the cab jolted violently and came to a sudden, wrenching stop. The lights went out. We were in total darkness. In the pitch black, I heard the faint, wet sound of a knuckle rapping on the elevator doors. Then the dry, gravelly voice of the old woman whispered, "You forgot to say goodbye." I scrambled for the buttons, stabbing at the one button repeatedly. The elevator didn't move. I heard Ben crying hysterically in the corner. I focused entirely on the button, pushing it until I heard the faint thrum of the cables engaging. The doors held fast, and the cab started moving again. We shot downward. The speed was terrifying. The lights flickered back on as we reached the ground floor. The doors slid open to reveal the familiar, dusty basement of the Sterling Tower. We scrambled out, not looking back, and ran through the parking garage until we burst out onto the empty city street. We never spoke about what happened inside, but the fear lingered. A few weeks later, Liam tried to take his life. When I visited him, he was catatonic, repeating one thing over and over. "He's waiting on the 10th. I quit my job and moved to a small town. I refuse to live in a building taller than 2 stories, and I take the stairs everywhere. But sometimes, when I'm alone in an enclosed space, I still feel the cold, heavy dip of the floor beneath my feet, and I smell ozone. I know that when that woman smiled and pointed at me, She didn't just let us leave the 10th floor. She put us on a waiting list. And someday, I know I'll get an invitation to go back up. Story 3. I have a strange nostalgia for old technology, especially the heavy, boxy kind that hums. A few months ago, I was browsing a local flea market when I saw it, a massive, wood-grain CRT television from the late 80s, complete with an enormous picture tube and those telescoping rabbit ears. I didn't need it, but I bought it for $40, hauling the 60-pound monster back to my small apartment. I loved the look and the smell of the old circuits. I quickly discovered the main appeal wasn't the fuzzy picture, it was the static. When the channels went dark, the screen filled with that glorious, pure white noise, the hiss and flicker of cosmic background radiation. It was mesmerizing, and I started leaving it on late at night, letting the sound lull me into sleep. It was about a week into this routine that I saw him. It was 3 a.m. I was half asleep on the couch, the apartment dark except for the glaring, flickering light of the television static. I happened to open my eyes and look at the screen. The chaos of the noise was still there, but deep within the snowstorm of black and white dots, I saw a shape. It was a silhouette. A tall, thin man, standing perfectly still, facing the camera. He was far away in the static, almost lost in the noise, but undeniably there. It was like looking through a frosted window at someone standing on the street outside. I sat bolt upright. My heart started pounding against my ribs. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was hallucinating. When I looked back, he was gone. Just a normal, frantic white noise. Sleep deprivation, I told myself. I got up, walked over, and turned the TV off. The picture tube faded with a sharp, electronic pop. The next night, I tried to avoid looking, but I couldn't resist. I left the TV on static again. I read a book, keeping my gaze down. Then, around the same time, I felt a nervous compulsion to look up. He was back. This time, he was closer. His silhouette was clearer, more defined. He was still standing, still facing the screen, his arms hanging straight down. The terrifying thing was the sense of perspective. It looked like he was standing in an actual room, and that room was inside my television. I could almost make out the texture of his clothes, a loose-fitting suit, dark and faded. I stared at him for 5 minutes, unmoving. He stared back. The static man. Finally, I raised my hand and slowly, tentatively, I waved. I waited. The static man remained rigid. I started to lower my hand, thinking this proved it was just a pattern in the noise. As my arm passed my shoulder, the figure on the screen moved. It raised its own arm, slowly, deliberately, mimicking my movement. Its hand was vague, but I saw the motion. It waved back at me. I shot off the couch, adrenaline pumping. I screamed at the TV. "Who are you? What do you want?" The static man didn't flinch, didn't speak. He just dropped his hand, settling back into his perfectly still posture. I was terrified, but also deeply intrigued. I spent the next 3 days in a constant state of paranoia, only turning the TV on when my anxiety became unbearable, needing to confirm he was still there. He was always waiting. I discovered he would mimic my posture. If I sat on the floor, he seemed to crouch. If I looked away, the static noise would change slightly, becoming rougher, until I looked back, and it would normalize. He was learning my habits. On the 3rd night, I decided I couldn't live with this. I walked across the room, grabbed the heavy, thick plug, and yanked it out of the wall. The screen went dark immediately, the image collapsing into a tiny, dying white dot in the center of the screen. I stood there, panting, looking at the silent, dead machine. Freedom. But then I heard the sound. It was faint, barely audible, but I heard the rhythmic, familiar hiss of white noise. It wasn't coming from the speakers. It was coming from the cathode ray tube itself. I crept closer to the black screen, tilting my head. The sound was definitely coming from inside the glass. I pressed my ear against the screen. The hiss was there, and underneath it, a soft, dry whispering. I couldn't make out the words. but it sounded like someone was trying to talk to me through a thick pane of glass. Overcome by a sudden, violent rage mixed with sheer terror, I grabbed a heavy metal paperweight from my desk. I swung it and smashed the glass screen. The noise was deafening, the shattering glass, the implosion of the vacuum tube. But mixed with the mechanical sound was a loud, high-pitched shriek. It wasn't the sound of breaking electronics. It was the sound of a human scream, amplified and distorted by static. I staggered back, covering my ears, watching the shattered, weeping glass. The hiss died instantly, and the apartment went completely silent. When I finally lowered my hands, I looked at the wreckage. The room was dark, lit only by the streetlights filtering through the window. I walked cautiously toward the TV, shining my flashlight on the mess. I scanned the pieces of the shattered screen, which were reflecting the room in jagged fragments. Most of the shards reflected my scared face, my apartment ceiling, the walls. But there was one large piece of convex glass, nestled among the wooden cabinet. Its reflection wasn't right. It showed a clear image of a smiling face, white, with wide black eyes, looking out. It was the face of the static man. I threw the light away and scrambled out of the apartment. I threw the television into the dumpster that night, drove it to the county landfill, and watched them bury it. I never owned a TV again. But sometimes, when I'm walking home at night, and I pass a window that reflects my image, I look closely. And in the very center of my reflection, I can sometimes see a faint, tiny, dark silhouette, standing perfectly still, waving slowly. He didn't need the TV to watch me. The TV was just how he got my attention. Story 4. When my wife and I bought our first house in suburban Connecticut, the property was great, save for one eyesore, an old, beat-up wooden shed tucked into the back corner of the yard. It was leaning, rotting, and covered in moss. The first thing on my DIY list was to tear that thing down and build a nice patio. I wish I had just painted it and left it alone. The demolition was easy enough. The walls came down with a few good shoves, and the flimsy tin roof peeled off easily. But when I got to the floor, things got strange. There was no dirt, no gravel, no typical shed floor. Instead, there was a perfectly square slab of concrete, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, sitting flush with the surrounding dirt. It didn't look like a foundation, it looked like a gigantic tombstone. My first thought was that it was a septic tank cover or an old cesspool, but there were no access points, no handles, no joints. It was a solid, unblemished sheet of gray stone. I figured I'd break it up with my sledgehammer. I swung the 9-pound hammer as hard as I could, hitting the same spot 3 times. The sound was a dull, heavy thud, and the only result was a small, dusty scuff mark. This wasn't poured concrete, it was reinforced bunker material. Over the next 2 days, I rented a jackhammer and brought my friend Mark over. We spent 6 agonizing hours fighting this slab. The concrete was at least a foot thick, embedded with steel rebar. We finally managed to crack the center, creating a gaping spiderweb of fractures. Using a heavy pry bar, we levered up a jagged, triangular section near the middle. The sound of the concrete tearing free from its base was sickeningly loud. When the piece came loose, we shone the flashlight into the opening. The slab was not sitting on dirt or pipes. It was covering a hole. A perfect circle, about 2 feet in diameter, cut directly into the ground. It descended straight down into absolute darkness. It looked like a well shaft, but it smelled wrong, cold, metallic, and faintly sweet, like burned sugar. Mark, being the more cautious one, tied his phone to a rope and lowered it down, recording video with the flashlight on. We watched the footage on playback. The shaft descended for about 40 feet before opening up slightly into a small, cylindrical chamber. The walls of the chamber were smooth, dark stone, not natural rock. This wasn't a well, it was built. Then Mark let out a slow, terrified breath. Stop the tape. Freeze it. About a foot off the floor of that dark chamber, secured to the wall with what looked like a rusted hook, was a box. It was a heavy, old steamer trunk, secured shut by thick chains. The phone camera zoomed in on the top of the box. Scrawled crudely onto the lid in faded white paint was a single phrase: "Do not let it ring." My blood turned to ice. Ring? We spent the rest of the afternoon rigging up a harness and pulley system. We had to know what was inside that trunk. It took 2 hours to haul the heavy, mud-caked metal box up from the darkness. We opened the box with a pair of bolt cutters. Inside, nested in a bedding of ancient, brittle straw, was only one item: an old rotary telephone. It was black and heavy, the kind with the circular dial, but it was cracked and covered in what looked like dried mud or black mold. It was completely disconnected from any line. It was just an object. We stared at it, deeply disturbed. Why the sign? Why the rebar and concrete? Why bury a phone 40 feet underground and warn someone not to let it ring? Mark grabbed the phone, his face pale, and was about to throw it back into the hole when I noticed something else inside the concrete triangle we had lifted. Etched into the inside surface of the slab, the part that had been facing the hole, were symbols. They weren't letters, they were simple, repetitive geometric carvings, circles with crosses through them, nested triangles, and lines. It looked like some kind of protective warding, carved to face the abyss it was sealing. As I stared at the symbols, the phone in Mark's hand made a sound. Not a ring, not a bell. Just a soft, mechanical click, the sound of the dial tone engaging, even though it wasn't connected to anything. It was a dry, hollow sound that seemed to come from the deep chamber itself, not the receiver. Mark screamed and dropped the phone back into the trunk. The noise stopped immediately. We grabbed the heavy trunk, dumped it back down the hole, and used the jackhammer to smash the remaining concrete slab into pieces small enough to shove back into the opening. We piled heavy dirt, rocks, and the original shed's cinder blocks over the spot. We didn't even bother to smooth the earth. We just covered it and left. We moved out 3 weeks later. The house was impossible to live in. Every night, in the deepest part of the silence, you could hear it. A faint, distant, mechanical click coming from deep within the foundation, vibrating through the floorboards. It sounded like an old machine was trying to dial a number. I don't know who or what the previous owner sealed down there, but I know it wasn't dead. It was just contained. And after we opened the door and pulled out its means of communication, it started trying to call out again. We ignored the clicks and the eventual faint, muffled, far-off ringing that started around 3 a.m. every night. But I still wonder what would have happened if we had picked up the phone. Story 5. I've spent most of my life hiking the backcountry of the Pacific Northwest. I know the rhythm of the woods, the way the sun filters through the canopy, the smell of damp moss and pine needles. The forest is huge, yes, but it's stable. It doesn't change quickly. But the forest where we found Elias Vance's cabin wasn't stable. It was hungry. My friend Dave and I were 4 days into a tough climb in the Olympic National Forest when we got hopelessly turned around by an unexpected squall. We lost the trail, the GPS was dead due to the cloud cover, and we were facing a night out in the open, which is bad news when the temperature is dropping below freezing. We were near collapse when Dave spotted it, a faint suggestion of a roofline through the rain. It was an old United States Forest Service, USFS, fire warden's cabin. It was tiny, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, built entirely of rough-hewn timber, and clearly hadn't been used in decades. The chimney was choked with vines, and the porch was rotted through. But the heavy, steel door was still locked with a chain. We smashed the lock with a rock and stumbled inside. The air in the cabin was musty, but dry. There was a cot, a rusted wood stove, and a small desk against the wall. On the desk, illuminated by the last shreds of evening light coming through the single, grimy window, sat a logbook. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger, and it was open. "Ranger Station," Dave whispered, relieved. "Someone must have been through here recently." I picked up the book. The first entry was dated July 12, 1988, written in a clear, deliberate hand, "Elias Vance, new warden. Posting is remote. Will establish communications tomorrow." The silence here is profound. We realized this was the logbook of the ranger who went missing in this sector nearly 30 years ago. I knew the story. The woods just swallowed him whole. We started flipping through the pages, looking for clues, but what we found was far worse than we expected. For the first few weeks, the entries were normal: weather reports, wildlife sightings, inventory checks. Then, around the third week of August, the entries changed. August 20th, 1988. The trees seemed closer than yesterday. I spent the morning clearing the path to the latrine. It felt like I was fighting through new growth. I am starting to feel pressured by the green. August 25th. I checked my sight lines with the scope. I swear I could see the western ridge clearly last week. Now, the view is entirely blocked by timber. It's too thick, too fast. I have not heard a bird in 4 days. The silence is back, but it's not profound anymore. It's suffocating. September 3rd, the canopy is wrong. It feels like the dark outside is pressing down on the glass. I keep checking the outside walls. I hear the wood groaning. It sounds like the trees are trying to embrace the cabin. They want the light. We exchanged a look of sick realization. This wasn't paranoia, this was terror. We looked at the date on the logbook, September 5th. This man was gone 2 days after that last entry. I walked to the window and looked out. The light was almost gone, but I noticed something immediately. When we arrived, there was a small, 3-foot clearing around the cabin, just enough room to sit on the porch. Now, the foliage, thick, dark pine, rhododendron, and scrub brush, came right up to the glass of the window. The branches were pressed against the pane, slick with rain, obscuring the view. I swore I could see pine needles touching the glass that weren't there an hour ago. The trees are moving, I choked out. They're closer. Dave grabbed the book and flipped to the final entry, dated September 5th. The handwriting was frantic, vertical, and barely legible. They are here. I looked away for 1 minute. The walls are not wood. They are muscle. They are breathing. I hear the root sound. The door is barricaded. I have nowhere to go. There is no outside left. The light. They want The entry ended in a long, desperate smear of ink that looked like it had been dragged across the page as the writer was pulled away. Suddenly, a massive, splintering crack erupted from the wall behind the cot. It wasn't thunder. It sounded like thick, heavy wood being twisted. The cabin shuddered. The door! We have to get out now! Dave screamed. We ran to the steel door, unbolting it and wrenching it open. We stepped out onto the porch, but the 3-foot clearing was gone. The forest was an impenetrable wall of green and brown. Massive, dark trees stood shoulder to shoulder, their trunks touching the porch railing. The tiny path we had forced open to get here was completely choked with thick, newly grown branches and ferns. We had to fight our way out. We ran, blindly shoving through the dense, wet foliage. The branches were stiff and strong, scraping our skin. It felt like running through a living, fibrous tunnel that was actively collapsing around us. We kept running until we hit the ridge trail, a path that was clearly marked and paved with gravel. We didn't stop until we reached the main highway, hours later. We looked like we'd been mauled by bears, scratched, bleeding, and covered in tree sap and mud. We eventually got a lift and got home. We didn't report the cabin. We knew they wouldn't find it. But what haunts me isn't the cabin, it's the time anomaly. 3 days after we got back, Dave was looking at the photos we took on our digital camera. He was zooming in on the first picture, the one we took right when we entered the cabin. In the photo, you can clearly see the cabin porch, the front window, and the trees. The trees in the photo are maybe 20 feet away from the porch. The branches that were pressed against the glass when we fled the cabin were not 20 feet away. They were not 5 feet away. They were touching the glass. The forest wasn't just growing faster. It was regaining ground. The area around that cabin exists in a time where the natural world is accelerating its reclamation, pushing back the boundaries of civilization instantly. Elias Vance wasn't swallowed by the woods. He was buried by time. And when we went inside, we sped up our own clock. Every day since, the trees in my own suburban backyard look just a little bit taller. And every night, I swear I can hear the subtle, deep, groaning sound of wood growing and reaching out toward the light. Story 6. I hate parking garages. They're concrete bunkers designed to disorient you. Last fall, I drove into downtown San Diego for a convention, and I parked in a massive, multi-level structure near the waterfront. I took the usual precautions, snapped a photo of the pillar, level 4, section B, yellow, and noted the time, 4:30 p.m. I figured I'd be back by 9 p.m. I was wrong. I returned to the structure around 11:30 p.m. The convention had run late, and the garage was almost completely empty. The quiet was immediate and intense. Usually, you hear the distant rumble of the city, the echo of tires, or the clang of an elevator. Here, there was just the hum of the industrial fluorescent lighting and the sound of my own footsteps echoing on the concrete. I walked the stairs up to level 4. The lighting was sickly, casting long, distorted shadows off the support pillars. I found section B, but my car wasn't there. I walked the entire length of level 4, yellow. I checked the signs. I was definitely in level 4. But where section B should have been, the lettering on the pillar read, Section Z. I pulled out my phone. The picture clearly showed Section B. I must have misremembered the location, or maybe the sections wrapped around. I went to the ramp leading to level 5, deciding I'd check the levels above and below. But as I walked up the ramp, the concrete wall beside me had level 4 stenciled onto it. When I emerged from the short incline, the floor was painted yellow. The pillars were marked level 4. I had simply walked back onto the same floor. I tried the ramp leading down. I drove my eyes into the pavement, watching the painted stencils. Level 3. Good. I emerged onto the floor. It was painted blue. I walked to the nearest pillar. Level 4. A cold, knotting sensation started in my stomach. I was looping. The structure was supposed to be finite, but the geometry was warping. I was spending physical effort to move, yet I remained on the same repeating, sickeningly empty floor. I started walking quickly, trying to break the pattern. I followed the painted directional arrows leading to the exit. The arrows led me in a tight circle, guiding me past the same pillar, a scarred pillar marked MM7, 3 times in 5 minutes. The air grew progressively colder, and the lighting changed. The bright, humming fluorescence of the first few loops were replaced by dim, yellowish sodium vapor lights that cast the entire level in a murky, sepia haze. The cars parked in the stalls were now different. They were older, boxier, coated in a thick, fine, pale dust, as if they hadn't moved in decades. I kept walking, forcing myself not to panic, but the structure started to look impossible. I was in a section that should have faced the outside, but instead of the skyline, the chain-link barrier looked out onto another layer of the parking garage, impossibly close, but stretching away infinitely into the murky light. It looked like an endless, concrete canyon of parking spaces. I whispered, "I need to find my car." Suddenly, I saw it. Parked right in the middle of a row of pale, dusty relics, was my sedan. It looked exactly right. Same color, same dent in the passenger side door. Relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me dizzy. I ran toward it, pulling my keys out. But as I reached the driver's door, I paused. The car was dusty, but not covered in the decades-old dust of the other cars. It was covered in a fresh layer of dry, fine, black powder, like ash. I looked at the windshield. A note was taped to it. The note was written on a parking ticket stub. It was a single sentence, written in thick, clumsy handwriting, "We left your lights on. It's been too long." I looked through the window at the dashboard. My car had been sitting there, but the digital clock, which should have read around 1 a.m., was displaying 5 a.m. 5 hours had passed in this concrete purgatory. Then, I looked at the side mirror. Reflected in the glass was not the repetitive geometry of the parking garage. It was a dark, twisting, fleshy mass that seemed to adhere to the concrete pillar behind me, pulsating faintly. It wasn't a structure, it was organic. The pillar wasn't supporting the building. The building was growing from the pillar. I spun around. The pillar behind me was still concrete, but the air around it was vibrating, shimmering, and the humming of the fluorescent lights was replaced by a deep, guttural thrumming sound coming from the ceiling, from the walls, from the concrete itself. The structure was alive. I didn't try to open the door to my car. I didn't try to save anything. I ran blindly in the opposite direction from the infinite canyon. I ran toward the faint, familiar sound of distant traffic, the only sign of the outside world. I ran until I found a stairwell. I threw open the metal door and sprinted down 8 flights of stairs, not caring which level I was on. I burst through the emergency exit onto the street. It was 5:05 a.m. The sky was graying. I walked 4 blocks away and called a cab. I told the driver my car was stolen. I never went back for it. But sometimes, when I'm driving, I catch myself looking for my exit, and I realize the road has been perfectly straight for 15 miles, with no exits and no other cars. And when I check my rearview mirror, the road behind me is gone. It's replaced by a gray, repeating wall of anonymous concrete pillars, lit by sickly yellow sodium lights. And I wonder if I truly escaped the parking structure, or if the infinite, looping architecture of that place is simply expanding to contain the rest of my life. Story 7. I've been a professional photographer for 15 years. I love old gear, and last month, I snagged what I thought was the bargain of the century at a swap meet, a pristine Canon EOS D30, an older but legendary digital single-lens reflex camera. It felt solid and heavy in my hands. The vendor seemed eager to get rid of it, selling it for $50. When I asked why the price was so low, he just looked at me with tired eyes and said, "The memory is full. You can't clear it." I figured the firmware was buggy. I took it home, attached a high-speed lens, and powered it on. The external memory card slot was empty, but when I hit the review button, the screen lit up instantly. There was only one photo on the internal storage. It was a poorly lit, grainy image, clearly shot in low light with a long exposure. The subject was a hallway. It was unnaturally long, stretching into deep, vanishing blackness. The walls were peeling, the floor was slick, and the air felt dense just looking at the image. The kind of hallway you'd find deep in a forgotten asylum or bunker. And way down at the end, just a tiny speck, was a figure. Hunched, thin, and vaguely human. The date stamp on the bottom right corner read October 31st, 2047. I tried everything to delete it. Format the internal memory. Reset the factory settings. Connect it to my computer. The camera refused to acknowledge the photo's existence through the computer, but the minute I hit review, there it was, perfect and permanent. Skeptical but intrigued, I decided to test the camera. I went outside and took a picture of my dog in the park. It was a perfect, sharp image. I hit the review button to look at the photo I just took. My dog's picture flashed up, and then, instantly, the camera switched back to the hallway photo. But the hallway was different. The hunched figure was visibly larger. It had taken a step forward. I felt a cold rush of nausea. This wasn't a glitch. This was linked. Every new picture I took advanced the figure in the hallway photo. I started obsessively documenting the phenomenon. I took a photo of a brick wall. The hallway photo popped up. The figure was clearly closer. I could see its head was tilted, as if listening. I started rationing my shots. I realized that every time the camera's sensor recorded an image, it was doing 2 things, capturing the world I saw, and advancing the world inside the camera. It was a countdown. By the time the figure was halfway down the endless hallway, the terror was physical. I could see details now, the pale, shiny skin, the lack of hair, and the way its mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural smile. The hallway itself was starting to leak into my photos. When I took a picture of my coffee cup, the edges of the frame were blurred and darkened, as if the air around the cup was suddenly thick with the hallway's atmosphere. I showed the camera to Ben, my friend from college. He laughed nervously, suggesting it was a complex memory card virus. But when he took a picture of his own face, and the hallway photo appeared showing the figure 2/3 of the way down the corridor, his laughter died. It's moving faster, I noted, my voice shaking. It takes a bigger step now. I realized the camera wasn't just storing the image, it was storing the figure. It was using the camera's sensor to open a door, and every time the shutter clicked, the figure took a step toward us. I decided to stop taking pictures. I locked the camera in a safe deposit box at the bank. I lasted 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, I couldn't stand the waiting. I rushed to the bank, retrieved the camera, and drove home. I had to know how close it was. I pulled the camera out, my hands slick with sweat, and pressed review. The hallway image filled the screen. The figure was standing right at the foreground. Its pale, smiling face filled the lower half of the frame. Its hand was resting lightly on the lens hood. I could almost feel its breath on the glass. It was too late to run. It was right there. It was one click away from crossing the threshold. I grabbed a towel, wrapped the camera tightly, and backed away from my desk. I knew I couldn't delete the image, but maybe I could destroy the medium. I grabbed a heavy metal hammer. Before I brought it down, I had one final, terrified thought. What would the last picture be? What would it show when the figure finally stepped out? I held the camera up, pointing it directly at the wall, and hit the shutter button. The camera made a sharp, final click. The little LCD screen displayed the dark, blurry image of the plaster wall. Then, the screen went completely black. I brought the hammer down with all my strength, smashing the camera into 1,000 jagged pieces of plastic and wiring. The sound was brutal, final, and deafeningly quiet afterward. I had won. A week later, I found a micro SD card, one I didn't know the camera had, in a hidden slot underneath the battery. I had to know what the final photo was. I carefully inserted the tiny card into my computer. There were 2 files. The hallway photo was still there, except the figure was completely gone. The hallway was empty. The second file was named final.jpg. I clicked on it. The image filled my screen. It was a picture of my face. It was taken from a very slight low angle, extremely close up, poorly lit, and utterly terrifying. My eyes were wide with shock, my mouth slightly open in a silent scream. It was taken the moment I had hit the shutter button with the camera wrapped in a towel, pointed at the wall. The thing is, the figure hadn't stepped out of the camera. It had simply taken the camera from the inside, turned the lens around, and taken one last picture of me, capturing the exact moment the realization hit. And now, that image is fixed in a digital file. I deleted it immediately, but I know it's out there. Because every time I step into my apartment, I feel the faint, cold click of a shutter. And I know I am now the single, non-deletable subject of someone else's permanent memory. Story 8. I work the night shift at a long-term care facility outside of Seattle. It's quiet work, charting, monitoring vitals, and dealing mostly with the silence. But there was one patient in room 406, Evelyn Reed, who defied the silence. Evelyn had been in a vegetative state for 5 years following a massive stroke. She was sustained by machines, yet she was, for all intents and purposes, entirely gone. Until she started talking. It began subtly, about 6 months ago. I was alone with her around 3 a.m., checking her forward drip, when I heard it. A soft, dry whisper that seemed to scratch its way out of her throat. "The path is winding," she breathed, her eyes remaining fixed and unresponsive. "And the colors, they are gone." I jumped back, checking her monitor. Vitals stable. But the whispering didn't stop. She would talk in short, fragmented sentences, always describing a place. She never seemed to realize I was there. I started recording the whispers on my phone. The bell rings continuously. It's for the gate. The gate is made of bone. The quiet is too loud. It hurts the silence. They said the water is safe, but it's always frozen. And it smells like copper. The doctors dismissed it as complex auditory hallucinations resulting from brain activity or muscle spasms. But the whispers began to frighten me because they started intersecting with my reality. One morning, driving home, I was stuck in early morning fog. The road became totally obscured. For a moment, just a flash, my familiar suburban street seemed to melt away, and I saw a desolate, gray path stretching out where the pavement should be. It was winding, just as Evelyn described. I slammed on the brakes, sweating, and the illusion vanished. Then came the bell. It was a faint, brassy clang, always heard at the periphery of my hearing, always when I was alone. It was constant, high-pitched, and maddening. The worst part was that it only rang when I was near Evelyn's room. I started checking the names in her whispers against the facility records. They are waiting for Mr. Hayes. His cottage is ready, right by the frozen water. Mr. Hayes was a patient on the second floor who had passed away 3 days prior. Evelyn couldn't have known that. Alice is here now. She finally followed the bell. Alice was a former nurse on the day shift who had abruptly quit 2 weeks earlier, leaving without notice. Everyone assumed she had better job offer. My fear reached a breaking point when, 2 nights ago, I was sitting by her bedside, charting. The room was cold, despite the thermostat being cranked high. Evelyn's lips moved, and the dry whisper came out. "It's beautiful here, Sarah. You should follow the path." She used my name. A name she shouldn't know, a name she shouldn't be able to say, locked in her silent prison. I stumbled back from her bed, knocking over a tray. "What did you say?" I demanded, my voice shaking. She only smiled, a tiny, almost imperceptible upturn of the lips that wasn't possible for her muscle atrophy. She whispered again, and this time the voice wasn't weak. It was dry, confident, and filled with a chilling sense of welcome. "They built your cottage close to mine. It has the best view of the gate." I resigned immediately. I handed in my badges and filed a vague, panic report about patient-induced psychological trauma. No one took it seriously. I drove out of the state a day later, trying to put hundreds of miles between me and that sterile, silent room. But last night, I got a text message from an old coworker, another nurse on the night shift. It was short. "Did you hear about Nurse Thompson? She was found this morning in the linen closet, totally unresponsive. They think it was a sudden, massive seizure. She's in the ICU now." I sat down hard on my bed, staring at the message. I didn't need to ask which room Nurse Thompson worked in. It was room 406. I looked down at my phone again, at the text message thread. Below the news about Nurse Thompson, there was a new, unsent draft message that I had somehow typed without knowing it. It was addressed to Evelyn Reed's number, a disconnected number I had kept on my phone for the original recordings. The message read, "I can hear the bell now, Evelyn. It's getting louder." I smashed the phone. But the bell is real. It's ringing right now, a high, thin clang that pulls at my attention. And when I close my eyes, I don't see the inside of my eyelids. I see a gray, winding path, and in the distance, a figure waving to me from a small, stone cottage, beckoning me to finally follow the bell. Story 9. The house was perfect. 3 bedrooms, a big yard, and a massive, finished basement perfect for a home theater and a laundry room. But the basement wasn't entirely finished. In one corner, there was a heavy, industrial-grade wooden door secured with a brand-new, expensive deadbolt. This door separated the carpeted, drywall-finished area from one final, unfinished section. The previous owner, an elderly man, told us it was just for deep storage, and insisted he had misplaced the key. "It's full of old tools and boxes," he'd assured us. "You don't need to go in there." We were so eager to close the deal that we agreed. We didn't press. We should have pressed. A week after we moved in, the sound started. I was down in the finished part of the basement late one evening, assembling some furniture, when I heard a faint, rhythmic thump, 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 coming from behind the locked door. It was subtle, barely audible over the furnace, but distinct. It sounded exactly like someone driving a heavy, blunt object into wood. I walked up to the door and put my ear against the smooth, cold wood. The hammering stopped instantly. There was a pause, a moment of deep silence, and then a slow, heavy shuffling sound, like something massive dragging itself across a concrete floor. "Hello?" I called out, rapping sharply on the wood. "Is anyone in there?" Is that a water heater or something? Silence. Only the distant hum of the furnace returned. I decided it was an aging appliance that needed replacing. But the next night, the sound was different. It wasn't just hammering, it was work. Clear, recognizable sounds of construction. The slow, rasping pull of a handsaw cutting through lumber. The metallic squeal of nails being dropped into a tray. And the constant, heavy thump of something being driven into the subfloor. It sounded like someone was actively, diligently remodeling the unfinished area. My wife, Laura, heard it too. She was terrified. Mike, there is someone, or something, building something in our house. We need to call the police and tell them someone sealed themselves in the basement. We called the police. They checked the outside of the house, the small access window to the crawl space, and confirmed every exterior door was locked. They found no sign of forced entry or homelessness. They told us it was probably the house settling or a peculiar acoustic anomaly. The activity intensified. The work started to follow a schedule. It began at exactly 10 p.m. and stopped precisely at 4 a.m. And the sounds grew more confident. One night, I could hear a low, tuneless singing coming from behind the door, a guttural, humming noise that sounded deeply satisfied. I had to get in. I borrowed a high-powered drill and started drilling around the deadbolt. The wood was thick, and the lock was expensive. As the drill bit chewed through the wood, I could feel a cold breeze pushing out from the crack. And then, the drilling sound was answered. From inside the unfinished room, perfectly timed with my drill, a drill sound started up. It was slightly different, an older, slower motor, but undeniably a drill, boring into wood right on the other side of the door. The sound stopped exactly when I pulled my drill back. I slammed the key back into the lock and left the deadbolt secured. The thing knew I was trying to get in. The realization came when I was looking at the house's blueprints. The unfinished storage room was marked, but the dimensions were wrong. The room on the blueprint was only half the size of the space behind the locked door. The other half, a massive, unmapped void, extended directly underneath the finished section of the basement and into the central utility space, where the furnace and water heater sat. The thing had access to the entire underbelly of the house. I stared at the finished ceiling of the basement, right above where the secret space should have been. I noticed a subtle, faint discoloration in the drywall, a perfect square slightly recessed from the rest of the ceiling. It was where two large sheets of drywall met, but it looked unnaturally dark. I dragged a stepladder over, grabbed a utility knife, and cut into the ceiling, peeling back the drywall. Dust rained down on me. I shone the powerful flashlight beam into the void above. It wasn't a crawl space. It was a massive, empty volume of air between the ceiling joists and the main floor subfloor, a huge, horizontal hidden attic. And spanning the space, extending from the back wall toward the center of the house, was a newly built wooden structure. It was a platform, complete with railings and a small, narrow flight of stairs leading up. The stairs didn't lead to the main floor. They led to a perfectly framed opening in the subfloor above, sealed shut by a massive, freshly cut plywood sheet. It was a hidden, sealed room being built above the finished ceiling. The light beam illuminated a small, black object sitting on the newly built platform. It was a handsaw. Its teeth were stained red. As the beam lingered on the saw, a dark shadow moved at the far end of the space. I didn't see a shape, just the movement of something large and dense. And then, the sound of the saw being picked up and pulled across would return, but this time, it was coming from inside the dark space, directly above the opening I had cut. The work stopped. The singing stopped. And I heard the deep, heavy, satisfied exhale of breath. It was waiting. I knew that it wasn't trying to escape the room. It was trying to finish the room. And I had just opened a window into its workshop. I dropped the flashlight and scrambled down the ladder, my lungs burning. I didn't bother taping the drywall back up. I just grabbed everything I could and hauled Laura and myself out of that house forever. We called the buyers the next day and told them the basement was flooded, offering to sell for far below market price. We live in an apartment now, but every night I can hear the faint, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a hammer. And sometimes, when I walk across the living room carpet, I swear the floorboards feel unnaturally thick, as if there is a second, newly built subfloor directly underneath my feet, patiently waiting for the walls to go up. Story 10. Camping in the Chiricahua Mountains near the Arizona-New Mexico border is an exercise in isolation. The canyons are deep, the silence is oppressive, and the peaks are massive, heavily forested black silhouettes against the desert sky. My friends, Chris and Jake, and I had hiked 6 hours to find a secluded spot far from any marked trail, nestled in a small clearing near the base of a particularly sheer, jagged peak known locally as Black Tooth. We set up our tents, built a small fire, and enjoyed the vast, perfect quiet. That quiet was broken just after 3 a.m. I was yanked out of a deep sleep by a sound that wasn't just loud, it was seismic. It was a massive, wet, resonant thud that hit the ground like a meteor strike. My entire tent, the poles, the stakes, the zippers, vibrated violently. The metal canteen I had left outside the tent rolled across the dirt with a loud rattle. I sat bolt upright, heart slamming. "Did you feel that?" I whispered to Chris, who was in the tent next to mine. "Yeah," Chris rasped back, his voice thick with fear. "Earthquake?" But it was one single thud. We waited, staring wide-eyed at the dark ceiling of the tent, listening to the silence rush back in, thicker and heavier than before. We tried to rationalize it. A rock slide, a major geological shift. But the air was still, and the trees hadn't moved. Then, about 30 seconds later, it happened again. Thump. This one was louder, heavier, and closer. It came from the exact same direction, high up on the mountain slope above us. The sound was so deep, so full of bass, that it physically hit my chest. It wasn't the sound of rock impacting rock. It was the sound of something impossibly massive, impossibly heavy, striking the earth with padded, colossal force. It sounded like an elephant, but with the weight of an 18-wheeler. Chris threw open his tent zipper. "That's not a slide. That's movement." We scrambled out, grabbing our flashlights and standing together by the dying embers of the fire. The mountain peak rose above us, a looming, black wall of pines and stone. We shined our 3 powerful beams up the slope. The light didn't penetrate far, maybe 100 yards into the dense timber. We saw nothing but shadows. "It's walking," Jake whispered, his voice cracking. "It's coming down the mountain." The timing was consistent. Every 40 seconds, without fail, the mountain would absorb another devastating step. Thump. Closer. Now the ground beneath our boots was noticeably vibrating with the impact. The sound was so immense that it felt like the trees around us were groaning in pain. We started tearing down the camp, working in a panicked, silent frenzy, driven only by the terrifying countdown. The entity was clearly following a direct path toward the base of the peak, which was exactly where we were camped. The sound was now so close that the tent stakes were rattling wildly in the dirt. It had descended below the main tree line and was now in the final, steep section above our clearing. We were maybe 200 feet from it. Jake screamed, not from fear, but from the physical force of the sound. "It's too big! It's too big to be real!" We threw our gear into the back of my truck, which was parked haphazardly at the edge of the clearing. I jumped into the driver's seat, Jake and Chris scrambling into the passenger side, when the final, decisive step landed. Thump! This was not a sound, it was a detonation. The air pressure shifted violently, momentarily deafening us. The truck heaved on its suspension, and dust and leaves rained down from the trees. The impact was right outside the clearing, barely 50 feet away. I froze, my hand hovering over the key. We couldn't move yet. We couldn't start the engine. The creature was stationary, right there. Jake gripped my arm and pointed his shaky flashlight up. The beam cut through the air, hitting the massive wall of shadow that towered above the surrounding pines. We still couldn't see the body, but the beam finally caught something else. It caught the impossible scale of the shadow it cast. And then, we heard the sound of its breathing. It was a deep, guttural, wet sound, like a cavern being emptied of water. The sound of air being sucked into lungs so vast, so deep, that it made the air in our truck cab feel thin and difficult to breathe. It smelled like whetstone and ozone. I slammed the key into the ignition and put the truck in reverse. I didn't care about the trail. I just backed out blindly, tires spinning on the dirt, until we hit the old Forest Service road. We sped away without turning the headlights on, driven by the absolute certainty that if we had stayed 1 second longer, the mountain itself would have reached down and crushed us. We escaped the Chiricahuas that night, but we never escaped the dread. I live in a city now, surrounded by noise, but sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear a deep, structural settling sound. The rumble of a heavy truck, the shifting of a basement foundation. And every time I feel that deep, bass vibration, I flinch. Because I know that something that big, something that heavy, doesn't need to climb down the mountain. It just needs to take one final step, and it will be right outside my door. Story 11. There's a kind of peace that comes from long-haul driving. I'm Rita, and I've run the Interstate 80 corridor between Reno and Chicago countless times. When you're alone in a semi at 2 a.m., there's nothing but the engine's drone and the ribbon of black asphalt. I love the silence. But one night, near the salt flats of Utah, the silence was invaded by something that didn't belong. I pulled into a small, state-run rest area, the kind that's just a concrete parking lot, a water pump, and a dimly lit bathroom bunker. I was exhausted. I set my air brakes, drew the heavy curtain between the cab and the sleeper bunk, and climbed back. The air smelled of stale coffee and diesel, the perfect scent of sleep. I was maybe 20 minutes into a fitful rest when I woke up. I didn't know why. The truck was still, the lot was quiet. Then I heard it, a faint, continuous SHHHH coming from directly outside the passenger's side of the cab. I frowned, thinking it was a leak in the air system. I pressed the brake pedal to release any residual air pressure. The hissing sound didn't change. It was too steady, too rhythmic for a leak. I pulled back the curtain and peeked through the main windshield. The parking lot was empty save for 3 other semis parked far away. The closest one was 200 yards off. I looked at the passenger window. Nothing but my reflection and the dark, dusty concrete. I tried to go back to sleep, pulling the blanket over my head, but the sound seemed to amplify in the silence of the cab. It wasn't just a hiss anymore. It was starting to rise and fall, like the cadence of human speech, a soft, frantic chorus of whispers, all mixed together, a sibilant cloud of noise clinging to the outside of my door. I grabbed my flashlight and pressed the beam against the glass. The light cut through the black, revealing nothing. I lowered the window an inch. The cold, dry air rushed in, and the whispering exploded in volume. It was right there, outside the cab. It sounded like dozens of people standing inches from the glass, murmuring secrets, but I still couldn't make out the words. I slammed the window shut, my hands shaking. I sat in the bunk, adrenaline surging, listening to the impossible. The noise was constant, heavy, and frantic. I knew what I was hearing wasn't the wind or brakes. This was communication. I focused, straining to separate one distinct sound from the chorus. Finally, the random noise coalesced, pulling itself together into one clear, dry phrase, repeated over and over, softly, relentlessly. You're not supposed to be alone. You're not supposed to be alone. You're not supposed to be alone. It sounded like 100 voices, male, female, high, low, all saying the exact same sentence at the exact same tempo, right outside my head. I didn't feel threatened by an intruder. I felt terrified by a collective, invisible presence that was trying to tell me I was breaking a rule of the road. I scrambled out of the bunk and into the driver's seat. I didn't look outside. I didn't need to. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands fumbling, the chorus of voices swelling into a frantic plea the moment the engine roared to life. As the semi idled, I pulled up the curtain to check my blind spot in the passenger side mirror. The glass of the mirror was entirely fogged over with condensation, despite the cold, dry desert air. And etched into the fog, where the breath of the voices must have landed, was a perfect, elongated streak of condensation, drawing a symbol. It was a single, long, downward arrow, pointing directly at the ground, right beneath the cab. I screamed, slammed the truck into gear, released the air brakes, and tore out of that rest stop, kicking up dust and gravel. I pushed the semi far past the speed limit, driving until the sun rose and the memory of the whispers felt impossibly distant. I never stopped at a rest area again. I'd only pull over at brightly lit, busy truck stops or designated areas. I sold that semi 6 months later, convinced the truck itself was tainted. But even in the cab of my new truck, when the engine idles and the air brakes hiss, I sometimes hear it. A faint, dry shhhhhhhhhhhhhhh coming from the passenger side. Barely audible over the rush of the wind. And when I check my rearview mirror, sometimes the condensation on the glass is just a little too thick, and I wonder what's standing out there, waiting for me to pull over and finally realize I'm not supposed to travel the endless highway all by myself. Story 12. I worked the midnight to 8 shift as a custodian at the Federal Records Annex, a massive, brutalist piece of architecture built in the 1960s. The building was designed for bureaucracy, endless, identical hallways, sickly yellow fluorescent lighting, and the smell of old paper and ammonia. I knew every crack in the linoleum, every dead light bulb, and every locked door on the first floor. Except one. It was tucked into a dark alcove right next to the main electrical conduit closet on the west wing. A plain, steel maintenance door, painted the standard institutional beige. Unlike every other door in the annex, this one had no number, no sign, and no security lock, just an old, heavy brass knob and a keyhole that looked far too old for the building. Every other janitor I asked had never noticed it. The blueprints I managed to pull from the maintenance chief's office didn't show it either. That spot should have been structural support. For 6 months, I wiped the dust off that door and moved on. It was always cold to the touch and always locked. Then, one Tuesday night, while sorting through a forgotten key ring in a rusted-out maintenance cart, I found it, an antique skeleton key, unlike anything else used in the building. On an impulse, I went straight to the west wing. The key slid into the lock of the unnamed door with a smooth, decisive click. I paused, heart pounding, before twisting the knob. The door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing not the expected cluttered storage space, but a brightly lit, small room. It was maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with freshly painted white walls and pale gray tile flooring. It was completely empty. It smelled of ozone and cleaning chemicals, but unlike the rest of the annex, this room was pristine and warm. But the impossibility lay directly across the room. There was another door, identical in every way to the one I had just walked through, same beige paint, same brass knob, same archaic keyhole. I stepped inside the first room. The knob turned stiffly as I closed the door behind me. I looked at the second door. It had to be a utility closet, or maybe it connected to the main floor through some bizarre architectural choice. I opened the second door. It revealed a third room. Identical. White walls, gray tile, small, empty, and across from me, a fourth door. A dizzying dread set in. I wasn't moving through a building. I was moving through a perfect, repetitive structure that defied physics. I was in a sequence of liminal, empty boxes. I tried to speak, but the sound died instantly. The rooms were so sterile and empty that they seemed to absorb all sound, leaving a crushing, absolute silence. I decided to test the sequence. I walked through the fourth room, opening the fifth door, then the sixth, the seventh, the eighth. All identical. All empty. All silent. By the ninth room, I started to notice something wrong with my perception. It took longer to cross the floor than it should have. The distance between the entrance door and the exit door in each room seemed to subtly stretch as I walked, forcing me to take more steps than the physical dimensions should allow. The air grew intensely cold, causing my breath to steam. I reached the 10th room. I stopped in the center. I looked up. The ceiling tile was the same as the floor tile, pale gray and slick. But in the far corner of the ceiling, I noticed a slight darkening, a disturbance in the surface. I stood still, listening to the oppressive silence. And then I heard a sound from directly above me. A dry, harsh scrape. It sounded like heavy fingernails being dragged slowly across the inside surface of the ceiling tile. It was moving, not randomly, but deliberately, following the line of the ceiling joists, heading straight toward the center of the room. I looked at the 11th door, my escape route. I couldn't move forward. I couldn't look up. I turned back, desperate to leave the way I came. I flew through the 9th room, then the 8th, the 7th. I didn't care about the stretching distance. I reached the first room, the one I had initially entered from the main annex hallway. I grabbed the knob to pull the door open. But there was no knob. The door was a perfectly smooth, flat sheet of beige metal. The keyhole was gone. The entire surface was flush with the wall. The entrance I had used had sealed itself, leaving only the endless sequence of identical rooms and the final, unreachable door leading deeper. Panic seized me. I started hammering on the smooth wall, yelling, but the silence inside the room swallowed the noise instantly. I felt the cold air, heard the distant scrape growing louder from the ceiling of the 5th room. I ran back to the 10th room, where the scraping had begun. I threw myself at the 11th door. It held fast, locked tight. Driven by fear, I grabbed the fire extinguisher from the wall and started smashing the knob and lock. The door finally burst open, leading into the 12th, identical room. I ran through it, not stopping. The silence was closing in. I didn't stop until I smashed through the 16th room's door and found myself falling onto the familiar, scuffed linoleum of the main annex hallway. The door to the 16th room, and all the rooms beyond, slammed shut behind me. I spun around, expecting to see the beige door. The wall was smooth. It was the same blank stretch of structural support that had always been there. No alcove, no knob, no keyhole. I quit that night. I never went back to the annex. But I can't shake the feeling of that sterile sequence. And sometimes, when I'm walking down a long, white corridor in a hospital or a mall, I look toward the corner. And I see a perfectly plain, unlabeled beige door, waiting. And I know the scraping sound is still in there, following the stretching architecture, building more empty rooms, preparing a new wing for those who are curious enough to open the wrong door. Story 13. I moved into the Hawthorne apartment complex last year, a sprawling collection of identical brick buildings built sometime in the 1980s. It was cheap, sterile, and anonymous. It's the kind of place where you nod to your neighbors but never learn their names. But the anonymity was broken by a casual conversation with the woman who lived 2 floors down, Lisa. We were talking about childhood nightmares, the usual boring stuff, when she mentioned something specific. When I was 6, she said, stirring her coffee, I had this recurring memory, though I don't know if it was a dream. I grew up in South Carolina, miles from here. I would wake up, and I knew there was a huge, black dog sitting on the 3rd step of our front porch. Not barking, not moving. Just sitting and watching my window. It was massive, like a statue made of shadow. I froze. I put my cup down, staring at her. The 3rd step? Yeah. Always the 3rd. And it never moved. It just watched me. I grew up in rural Minnesota. We had a completely different style of house, and a 6-foot snowfall every winter. Yet, I had the exact same memory. Waking up in the dead of night, knowing with absolute certainty that a huge, silent, black dog was sitting motionless on the 3rd step of my porch, staring through my bedroom window. The shared memory was so specific it was instantly terrifying. We spent an hour trying to rationalize it, a common American folklore, maybe, or a widespread children's show reference we both forgot. But the next day, I asked the building's elderly maintenance man, an old, grizzled guy named Frank who'd worked the complex for 30 years. Frank, I asked, when you were a kid, did you ever remember seeing a big, black dog sitting on the 3rd step of your porch? Frank, who grew up in New York City, paused his sweeping. His face went pale. How do you know that? He whispered. It was huge, wasn't it? Made no sound. Just watched. Always the 3rd step. I used to think I was the only person who remembered that. Over the next few weeks, I asked 4 more long-term residents, all of whom had moved to the Hawthorne complex from different, distant states. Every single person, without exception, confirmed the memory. Always the third step. Always silent. Always a massive, black, motionless dog. We realized the terrifying truth. This wasn't a shared memory from our separate pasts. This was a shared implant. A collective psychological seed that had been planted in our minds when we were children, and for some reason, we were all drawn together to the Hawthorne complex. The memory was a blueprint for something that was about to manifest. The manifestations began subtly. I started seeing small, motion flicker shadows out of the corner of my eye that were too large to be a cat, too low to be a man. And then, one evening, walking home, I saw it. My apartment building's stairwell is concrete, 20 steps in all. As I reached the bottom landing, I looked up. The entire staircase was empty, but on the third step, clearly defined in the dim fluorescent light, was the deep, black shadow of an enormous, motionless dog, perfectly contoured to the step. It cast no light, and it wasn't connected to any physical object. It was just the shadow of the black dog. I backed away slowly, the memory overwhelming me with absolute dread. The shadow didn't move. It just sat there, waiting for me to pass. I stayed away from the stairs for 3 days, taking the elevator. But the memory was too strong. I started seeing the shadow on the third step of my shower, on the third step of the curb outside the grocery store. It was spreading, using our collective memory to gain purchase on reality. The final night, I was sitting in my living room, lights blazing, when I heard a distinct, heavy thump from the hallway outside my door. I knew it wasn't a human noise. I crept to the peephole and looked through. The hallway was dim and empty, stretching away toward the main stairwell. The third step of the main stairwell landing was visible. And there, sitting motionless on the third step, was the black dog. Not a shadow, not a memory, but a physical presence, a massive, silent creature made of pure, matte black fur that seemed to absorb all the light around it. It wasn't looking toward the main entrance. It was looking directly at my door. And then, very slowly, its enormous head turned toward the peephole. I saw them, 2 enormous, flat discs of pale yellow light where its eyes should have been, staring directly into the lens. The silent, eternal watcher had arrived in the present. I didn't open the door. I threw a duffel bag of clothes out the window and climbed down the fire escape. I never contacted Lisa or Frank. I just drove away and kept driving until I hit the coast. I live in a small, single-story cabin now. No stairs. But I can't shake the memory. I still have the image burned into my mind, the vast, motionless shadow, the yellow eyes, the third step. The collective memory that we thought was a shared past was actually a shared invitation. And now that the thing has stepped out of our minds and into the world, it doesn't need the Hawthorne complex anymore. It just needs a staircase. And I know, with chilling certainty, that it's already sitting on the third step of the tiny, 2-step porch of my cabin, waiting for me to open the door and invite the memory inside.